Hello and welcome to the program. More than 5 years after Ukraine's Euromaidan protests, when peaceful rallies turned into a massive standoff between unarmed civilians and riot police, the Euromaidan protests sparked massive changes in the country and society. We're joined today by the author of Ukraine's Maidan, Russia's War, a chronicle and analysis of the Revolution of Dignity, Mychailo Wynnyckyj. It's been presented at the 9th International Book Arsenal Festival. Mychailo Wynnyckyj is an author and associate professor of sociology at the National University Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So, what inspired you to write your latest publication?
Well, this is a very long time coming, in fact. I was writing an awful lot during the Maidan and during 2014, 15, and up until 18. Doing Facebook posts, doing various types of sort of small publications, and this was an opportunity to bring all of that together. The book, in fact, is as the title says, it's a chronicle and it's an analysis. So it's kind of an attempt to bridge somewhere between an academic and an activist, because I tend to be a little bit of both, which in fact is a very uncomfortable position, because when you're an activist, it's very difficult to have academic distance, and so it's one of the things that you see in the book is a little bit of tension between academia in the analysis portion and sort of a reflection on what in fact we lived through over the last 5 years as a chronicle.
And what significance does Euromaidan hold for you personally? Well,
first of all, I actually don't like the term Euromaidan, because I think the salience of Euro decreased significantly after the beatings of the students. Many of those students were in fact my students from Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, people that had been in my lecture hall just literally weeks before this whole thing happened. So I lived through this very much personally, and became very much personally involved. And then after the Maidan protests were successful, a lot of us became activists and became very much involved in various activities, either as NGOs or supporting others that were in government. And I try to chronicle, or in fact in the volunteer protests, in the volunteer movement, helping the war efforts. So I try to chronicle a lot of that and try to talk about what were some of the motivations of the people behind them, who were the key actors, etc. And then in the second half of the book, I talk about the fact that the revolution is very much an ongoing process. When we talk about revolutions, very often we talk about something that supposedly happened in the past. And this is actually a misnomer, because the Maidan protests happened in the past. But we know from examples like the French Revolution, the Soviet Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the American Revolution, these are all processes that last for 10, 15 years. And they begin with a change of regime, and then they have a certain sort of a life cycle, I guess, of transition. And usually after the change of regime, you have a period of sort of moderate reform, which is what we've just gone through. And then you have a fork, and some revolutions go in the direction of guillotines and terror and bloodshed, and others go in the direction of building new institutions and people becoming much more active in trying to build a new country. What I'm talking about is basically the American model, where we write constitutions and we become an example for the rest of the world for many hundreds of years afterwards. Or the French-Soviet model, which unfortunately turns into something that's not particularly pleasant. And I think Ukraine...
So where is Ukraine leading towards?
Well, Ukraine's at a fork. Ukraine's very much at a fork, and we don't know what the next 2 years will bring. But I will say that the revolutionary process is very much ongoing. We've seen this in the last election. We see a lot of new cleavages appearing, where the old system of looking at Ukraine, whereby Ukraine was supposedly a divided country between East and West, between a Ukrainian-speaking West and a Russian-speaking East, that's all gone. This is one country now. This is one nation, and this is something that we have perhaps to thank Putin for. But nevertheless, it's something that's happened, and now we have new divisions showing up. We have a creative class which has shown up, which is a very interesting and vibrant kind of community, which is centered in large cities and is very much sort of post-industrial. And then we have a Ukraine, which is approximately 75% of the population, which is very much agrarian and industrial, and that's the cleavage that we see now in the last election, sort of a creative class, urban, patriotic movement, very activist, which generally voted for Poroshenko, and then an industrial agrarian kind of movement that generally voted for Zelensky. That doesn't particularly bode well when it comes to theories of revolution in terms of what we're facing in the next year and a half, because we will be facing some more changes. And it certainly doesn't bode well for let's just say, a calm and peaceful presidency for Mr. Zelensky.
Right. In his speech, he spoke to over 60 million, how he said, Ukrainians who are living in other parts of the world, or ethnic Ukrainians, and he called them to come back to Ukraine and help rebuild the country. You yourself came back to Ukraine.
I'm not sure I came back. I actually like to say that I immigrated to Ukraine because my parents left as children during the Second World War. Immigrated to Canada, and I've been living in Ukraine for 17 years now. So I really didn't need Mr. Zelensky to tell me to come back or to immigrate. And in fact, one of the last things that President Poroshenko did while in office was to sign a decree giving me citizenship. So I'm pretty proud of the fact that I've become a Ukrainian citizen now. It's taken a long time. It was supposed to be a short journey. It's taken about 3 years since the original citizenship application went in.
So tell us a little bit about when you arrived to Ukraine and...
I've been going back and forth to Ukraine for the last, well, basically since '89, so for 30 years. But living in Ukraine for 17. This is very much a land of opportunity for those people that want to take the opportunity. And I like to talk about that because I think that there's two types of people living in Ukraine and of Ukrainian descent. There's those of us that want to have sort of a stable, a predictable lifestyle, and those are the ones that are generally leaving Ukraine because Ukraine is not stable or predictable. This is a place of revolution. This is a place of change. This is a place of transformation. But if you're into looking for opportunities, which are for opportunities for self-actualization, for self-realization, this is a place that's fantastic for opportunities. I would never be able to do the types of things that I'm doing in Ukraine, just in terms of being active in politics, being active in business, active in academia, and doing all of those three things at once, plus having 4 kids. I don't think that I'd be able to do that in Canada to the same extent that I'm doing it in Ukraine. The price for that is instability. So you don't necessarily know what's going to be happening tomorrow. And there are certainly certain types of entrepreneurial people that thrive on that kind of environment, and Ukraine is fantastic for that. But there are other people, obviously, that want more stability in life, and then those are the ones that are generally leaving. So
what sort of changes have you seen in Ukrainian society since living here? So you mentioned 17 years.
I have friends that travel to Ukraine every sort of 5-6 years. We don't necessarily, living in Ukraine, we don't see the extent of the change. Anybody that hasn't been here for a year, 2 years, 3 years, and then comes back, the place is unrecognizable. The massive amounts of change. It's changes in the way people interact with each other. It's changes in the new businesses that we see around us. It's changes in, it's just, everything is changing. It's a fascinating place simply because of the fact that it is a thriving transformation. What has changed? Young people's attitudes, older people's attitudes, attitudes to I don't even know what to put my finger on, because quite frankly, architecture changes, businesses open up, particularly in cities. I mean, obviously, when you go into a village, it's much less of a transformative environment. But Ukraine's large cities are very much thriving places for what we call the creative class. This is one of this is a place where we have one of the largest or fastest fastest growing number of things like, for example, co-working spaces. Programming, IT sector, arts, drama, everything that's got to do with creativity.
You know, the cultural sphere. But what about people's mindsets? You know, has that changed a bit?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Have you seen a bit of changes there?
5 years ago, before the Maidan revolution, people didn't, or the start of the revolutionary process, people were not actively involved in politics. They were not actively involved in their everyday lives. We have this, we have community involvement today, which we never would have had and never would have expected to see 5 years ago. As a sociologist, I see this in something we call social capital, which is just accumulating massively in a very fast kind of way. It's a very, very interesting phenomenon. People are becoming involved in managing their own apartment buildings. People are becoming actively involved in politics. We have a circulation of elites, which is unheard of anywhere in other countries. I mean, every time we have a parliamentary election, we have 50 to 60% of parliamentarians coming in that have never been in politics, and this is something that has been true for the last 15 years. In other words, every time we get people calling for new faces, I smile a little bit because, you know, the old faces are only 5 years old. And that's not something that is very common in Western countries. There's a lot more stability, certainly in politics, certainly in economics. You get new businesses forming, old ones going away. I mean, it's thriving on change. Now, that's uncomfortable to a lot of people. For me personally, I think it's something that's just very exciting.
You're a professor at the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy University, and you work with a lot of young people. And you know there are media reports of young people leaving the country, and we've seen. Well, I've personally heard the term brain drain being thrown around quite often by analysts, by politicians. Now, what do you make of that? Do you think that's truly happening? And if so, how does the Ukrainian government go about attracting and bringing these young minds back into the country?
I think the brain drain is massively overblown. I think it's something that we talk about way too much. If we look at migrant workers in Ukraine, or rather migrant workers in the West coming from Ukraine, these are generally not people that have either higher education or coming from prestigious schools, etc. These will be people that will be filling manual labor jobs. And manual labor jobs in Western Europe are generally filled by Ukrainians. Well, that's actually not exactly true. Let's put it this way: the Poles are filling manual labor jobs in Germany and in Britain. Ukrainians are filling manual labor jobs in Poland. The brain drain that is talked about is actually massively overblown. What we have is a thriving IT sector. Who works in the IT sector? Those are brainiacs. We have an IT sector, by the way, that is growing at a rate of 30 to 35% per year. IT programming services, engineering services are today Ukraine's third largest export, and it very shortly will become more than metal. Which, I mean, that's not about brain drain. That's about people working here and becoming part of the global economy. And not just selling their skills in terms of programming, but actually doing the design work. We have two what's called unicorns at the moment. In other words, billion-dollar companies that are located in Ukraine. This is considered to be one of the best places in the world for startups, and it's one of the most exciting places in the world for startups. So, I mean, I think that when we talk about brain drain, we're certainly not talking about creative class young people leaving the country. Quite the opposite. People that are trying to thrive on change, that are thriving in this kind of environment. What we do have is we have a problem of brain drain from small towns into big cities. Well, that certainly we do have. Kyiv is thriving, Lviv is thriving, Dnipro, Odessa to a certain extent, Kharkiv. These are all cities that are doing extraordinarily well. And we have a manual labor issue because it's actually very difficult in Ukraine today to find a qualified welder, to find a qualified plumber.
Because they've all left.
Yes, because they've all left. But that's not brain drain. That's the issue of manual workers leaving and migrant workers.
But haven't we seen, kind of with the visa-free regime, more young people taking the opportunity to travel around Europe, and then perhaps even finding opportunities there that they wouldn't necessarily find in Ukraine, and comparing wages and comparing student kind of wages, which for a lot of young people that's hard to come by in Ukraine. So when they go abroad and they see someone who's of the same age but makes quite a bit more money than them, then they perhaps consider, why don't I stay here?
Well, if they're smart, what they do is they actually count cost of living as well. And then they start looking at, wait a second, how much does it cost to live in France or Germany or Britain, and on those wages, and how does it, and what's the cost of living in Ukraine? And someone that has a Western education that comes back to Ukraine is very often will be offered a job that will be, quite frankly, I mean, sure, in terms of nominal amounts, it'll be less than you would be paid in Western Europe. But quite frankly, it costs you about a third of what it costs to live in Western Europe here. So if you're making, if you're making half of the salary, but it costs you a third to live, you're still doing better. So most people will find that to be a lot more attractive. And what I see is, I mean, in my students, for example, I will see excellent students finishing Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, finishing places like Ukrainian Catholic University, finishing Shevchenko, finishing KPI, Polytechnic. They're BAs, and then they'll be going off to do a master's in Europe someplace, and then they'll be coming back. And these are the people that I call the creative class. These are the ones that will be the most active in terms of politics, in terms of business. These are the ones that are thriving and building a new Ukraine.
And perhaps civil society as well.
Absolutely.
Because Ukraine has such a strong civil society that, took up a lot of the kind of the responsibility
and I think
the
these
Euromaidan revolution.
So, like I said, I think that, your question was about brain drain. I think there is an issue of migrant labor, obviously. We have statistics which show us that the largest amount of the largest supplier of foreign currency into Ukraine at the moment is the migrant worker. In other words, we're getting more foreign currency coming into Ukraine from migrant workers than we do from selling grain, which is a lot. So it's the largest source of that. But it's not coming from brains. Brains are staying here. It's coming from manual labor. Now that's causing other problems because, like I said, it's tough to find a plumber. Very difficult to find a welder, even more difficult to find a shipper. And that's creating an issue where now wages are starting to rise in Ukraine for those types of manual labor jobs. And now we're seeing a lot less people starting to leave to Europe because of the fact that the wages are coming back up. In other words, the market mechanism is gradually working. It's just perhaps taking a little longer than everybody would expect it to.
Right. So my last question, coming back to the Euromaidan revolution, what sort of changes would you like to see in Ukrainian society, given the aspirations and the hopes that a lot of people had during Euromaidan?
Your questions are please excuse me, but they're pretty typically Ukrainian. We see the negative side of things in Ukraine. The purpose of writing the book was for us to perhaps realize the amount of positive that is actually coming out of this society in the last 5 years. Very often Ukraine is looked upon as being a territory that is sort of contested between the West and Russia. In fact, there's a lot of things going on in this country which are absolutely fascinating and are generally unknown to the Western, to the English language reader and to the English language sort of observer. One of those things is, for example, the fact that we called our revolution the revolution of dignity. And that is a new concept because, in fact, it's a bad translation. Hidnist in Ukrainian does not translate into dignity. It's a different kind of concept, which I write about in the book. There's a lot of things that are happening here in terms of the concepts of fairness, concept of dignity, concepts that are pretty philosophical, if you like, but they're actually civilizational changing. This is a place which is like the United States 250 years ago, was pretty marginal to sort of European civilization. This is a place that is also pretty marginal, but just like 250 years ago, we had new ideas about democracy, about markets that came up that basically created a new kind of society for the next 200 years in a very marginal, peripheral place of the world. I'm convinced, and I'm very proud of the fact that I'm part of this. This is a place where this same type of thing is happening. We're seeing new senses. We're seeing discussions about new ways of organizing society that are sort of burgeoning and driving a lot of new initiatives. And I think that that's something that we don't, in Ukraine, have enough appreciation for. We like to look for what we call zrada. We like to look for the negative. Whereas, in fact, I think we should be looking a lot more positively at what is, in fact, is going on in our heads, in our practices, in the way we live.
So I guess the changes that you want to see in society are more personal within every individual.
I don't think it's a matter of personal. No, I think everything is. I mean, look, at the end of the day, we've become a much more transparent society. We've become a much more just society. Yeah, we have problems with the fact that that people are not necessarily thrown into jail, but at the same time, we're much more careful and much more, how should we say? I think it's a question of fairness. We're much more fair to each other than we would have been, let's say, 5 years ago. And in fact, I would suggest that we're much more fair to each other informally than people in Western Europe. I think that this is something that we've actually gone much further in terms of civilizational development than many Western societies in terms of moving towards this idea of a post-industrial kind of new era. Now, when I say that, I'm talking again about big cities. And I think one of the issues in Ukraine today is how do we balance between the really, if you like, the massive changes that are happening in the big cities, and how do we pull the rest of the country along with us? Because rural environment Ukraine, small city Ukraine is unfortunately still pretty backward.
But I mean, if you look at other Western countries and even, you know, Western European countries, I wouldn't go so far as to say that, for example, in France, that a lot of the, you know, rural areas are well developed to an extent where they can compete with life and wages in the city. Thank you very much for joining me today. It was a very interesting discussion. That was Mychailo Wynnyckyj, writer and associate professor of sociology at the National University Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more.